is a little short, so I'm just going to take a quick minute before I get into my paper to give you myself sometimes in compromising situations with arrowhead collectors, looters, other such individuals. So my mindset is going to be coming from a very professional, archaeologically professional background. I believe that those who find items should leave them in their place for the professional. Now, this isn't to say that I don't have a little bit of arrowhead collecting in my own blood before I entered this profession. So I do understand the excitement and the thrill of discovery and of collecting items of antiquity. However, I have also found as a professional that it is very difficult to convince anyone in my discipline of anything if they themselves haven't discovered it, and even if they did discover it, to try and explain what they're actually looking at. So with items of antiquity, if you do not leave it in place, they say that the provenience is lost, and it is very difficult to then argue the point that it's authentic or not, or where it even came from. And that's going to be part of my paper, so I will get into that right now. Okay. On January 8th, 1999, Thomas Campbell flew into Salt Lake City from Texas, bringing with him what appeared to be a metal short sword. This item was claimed to be pre-Columbian and to have been found in West Texas. It was further claimed that the sword had been found by an arrowhead collector while he was looking for projectile points. The story goes, as it was relayed to me, something like this. An arrowhead collector had been digging for Clovis points, very similar to the ones that you're seeing here. These items here, they're very popular on eBay and other places by collectors. So he was digging for these Clovis points, which are stone spear points used by the Paleo-Indian culture dating to approximately 10,000 plus BC. While digging with a cat, a small bulldozer, as many of you might know what I'm talking about, he came across the sword at a depth of approximately 6 feet. From that point, the sword was given by the collector to a friend, who in turn, knowing Mr. Campbell, notified him of the find. Campbell contacted FARMS, for those of you who don't know what FARMS is, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, who in turn contacted Dr. Stephen Jones to have some tests done on it and have it further examined. The metal sword of supposed pre-Columbian origin was presented by Campbell and Brent Hall of FARMS on the afternoon of January 8th to Dr. Jones of the BYU Physics and Astronomy Department, and also Dr. John Clark of the BYU Anthropology Department. He's an archaeologist whose emphasis is in Mesoamerican archaeology, for examination and testing. After initial examination of the sword, which consisted primarily of a visual examination, as seen in this slide here, many of you will probably recognize Dr. Jones here, the belly, and his Dr. Clark, and they're examining the artifact in that slide. Dr. Clark suggested bringing in Dr. David Johnson of BYU Anthropology Department also to examine it. This suggestion was made because Dr. Johnson's Old World Middle East background, for those who might know him, he works in Petra primarily. Dr. Clark felt that the sword had a distinctive Old World look to it. A phone call was made by Hall to Dr. Johnson, who agreed to come over and visually examine the sword. Photos were taken of the sword by myself as the documentation process began. After the photos were taken, a very small fleck of metal was removed from the hilt by David Tingey, who ran the XRF lab for BYU at the time. And does he still run the XRF lab? Yes. David Tingey, for the purpose of subjecting it to XRF examination. I'm just going to stop here. I'm going to be mentioning in my paper these terms XRF and PIXI, and for those of you who don't understand those terms or exactly what types of tests those are, I could get into it, but that's a whole different paper, and you can talk to Dr. Jones about it because he's the physicist and I'm just a dirt archaeologist. I then removed some sediment also for XRF analysis that was embedded in the ridge area of the hilt. This is the object in question. Right here, there is a very defined ridge line all along the hilt, and embedded in some of these areas was some sediment, of which I removed using a scalpel. After this, a pixie examination, which is another form of testing, was done on different points of the sword as another means of testing the sword's elemental makeup. Oops. Whoa, hey, wow. Technical difficulties here. Oh, that's not good. If you'll bear with me just a second, I apologize for this. I think I'm going to switch over. I'm going to actually start right there. Okay, I think I'm going to. My mouse might be freaking out on me. Okay. The sword and the story behind it presents several dilemmas for one to consider, 6 of which I will briefly point out. First, it immediately arouses skepticism that a metal sword of pre-Columbian origin would be found in the USA due to lack of other such finds. Second, the time frame and association with which this sword was supposedly found is very, very early. Paleo-Indian, or even the archaic time period which followed, is much earlier than that which a bronze short sword would or should be found. Third, the sword is a copper-tin mix, which is indeed bronze, this fact being established from both the XRF and Pixie tests. I'll discuss that later. A bronze weapon, however, though helping to prove, or at least begin to prove its authenticity as an ancient artifact, is hard if not literally impossible to place in the Americas due to the lack of pre-existing finds of Bronze Age metals in the U.S., and that's just coming from my own research. I heard mention in just the previous paper of a possible bronze sword, but I'm just coming from making that statement from my own personal research at the time this paper was written. Fourth, there is the loss of provenience, which I briefly mentioned before I started my paper, due to the collector removing the sword from the site without proper documentation. Fifth, which actually became the primary basis for my personal research with the sword. The sword has a very old world look or design to it. This fact was originally pointed out by Dr. Clark and agreed with by Dr. Johnson. Sixth, if this is an authentic artifact, then not only is it a major and fascinating find, but it also raises many questions, such as what culture does it belong to and how did it get where it was found? So here's my research summary to date, and I just want to make a note that I personally haven't done much in the area of the bronze sword, and that'll become more evident as I continue on in my paper, than that research which I did in the spring of 1999. When asked to present my findings and research on this bronze sword, it was I had to go to my file cabinet and brush off the dust due to the fact that, well, I'll get into that in a minute. The bronze sword was first visually examined by Dr. Jones, Dr. Clark, myself, and finally Dr. Johnson. Dave Tingey of the BYU Geology Department removed a very small fleck, as mentioned earlier, from the ridge of the hilt, just before the blade begins and the hilt ends. So right in here is where he removed just a very small, when I say fleck, imagine in your mind a pinhead, and that's about what we're talking about. When this was presented to us for testing, they wanted us to use non-invasive methods to do this testing, and then they were very apprehensive about us, maybe scraping off a huge chunk or anything like that. And we didn't want to damage the artifact ourselves at our end, but that's why we use these the Pixie and the XRF, because you don't need very much material in order to be able to pick up accurate tests. So when I keep saying the term fleck, that's what I'm talking about the size of a pinhead. Let's see. After this was done, a small amount of sediment was removed using a scalpel from each side of the hilt along the inside ridge by myself for soil analysis. So I removed soil from just about that point there and this is actually showing both sides of the bronze sword. And right here, I removed another small soil sample or sediment sample. I'm just going to briefly note this because this slide won't come up again in my present, but I want you to note this little circular piece here, which appears to be a rivet, and that'll make sense later. The metal fleck and sediment samples were examined by XRF to determine some of the trace elements. The sword turned out to be mostly copper and some tin, with the sediments being mostly silicone, which you would expect. Some copper leaching into the sediments was also observed to have taken place. This indicates the soil has been embedded in the hilt for some time, so I felt rather confident that the soil that we removed wasn't something that, if someone's trying to fake you out, they just slap some dirt on it to make it look dirty. In order for this copper to appear in the XRF and the Pixie would mean that it would have had to have been in contact with the sword for quite some time. And then here's all the trace elements that were also found in the artifact. The sword was then taken to the physics underground laboratory, where it was measured and documented using a caliper. Any specific attributes that were noted on the drawing made by myself. So this is a drawing I made with measurements of the sword itself. Anytime I noticed something very that I felt was specific and would further my own research when it came time, I noted on this drawing that I made. Scott Perry, a physics graduate student at the time, then assisted in conducting Pixie tests on specific points of the sword to better determine what the trace elements of the metal were. After taking several readings at different points on the sword with a Pixie beam, and this is, once again, we use this because it was non-invasive, and so we didn't even have to remove any metal at the time. We could actually just have these beams shooting specifically on the artifact itself without any damage to it, and it would give us readings. From the data taken from the Pixie test, the primary elements of copper, tin, and arsenic, possibly lead. There was a little between the arsenic and lead. We were not as clear on that, but it was definitely bronze. After hurriedly documenting and analyzing the sword for less than a single day, it was taken back to Texas by Campbell. I had the photos of the sword developed and began my research, specifically that of attribute analysis. I chose the hilt of the sword as my main focus because of its distinctive style and design. After extensive research of the Celtic Bronze Age and its swords, I started with the Celtic Bronze Age as a direct result of a suggestion made by Dr. Johnson, who at the time of his visual examination noted that it looked very Celtic in design to himself. So that's everyone needs a starting point, and that's the starting point that I took. I concluded that though there were some similarities in the hilt style, there weren't any exact matches, and in fact more differences than similarities as I read more about the design and the makeup of Celtic swords. One of the similarities I did find, and I could see why Dr. Johnson would suggest this, is this kind of what I coined. I don't know. In none of the literature, it wasn't this, but I just call it the I shape, where you have the narrow part and then the two branching out at both ends. After briefly discussing my findings with Dr. Johnson, Johnson suggested possibly looking more closely at the Mycenaean culture of Greece, because he had found some similarities between the sword in question and the Mycenaean bronze sword design. I switched my focus at this time to the Greek Bronze Age and the Mycenaean culture in particular. As my research progressed, I found many attribute similarities between the bronze sword in question and the Mycenaean bronze swords, but still no exact matches. Again, I just would like to point out a few of those. Some of the similarities that I found was this nice, I talked about how the hilt of the sword had this groove where you could actually have had some sort of inlay in it. A lot of theirs were that, and these little rivets that would have been used to rivet in whatever, material that they were using in the hilt. And some of the design, this eye design again, is seen somewhat, theirs is more flared and less eye-shaped. This one which was actually a bronze longsword, not a short sword, had a very similar looking hilt. But one thing I continued to read in the literature is that the Greeks in general were very warlike people, and they loved to put these nice little deep grooves so they could do the biggest bang for the buck, I guess, do more damage. And that's one thing that the sword we were examining did not have. Though the hilt was similar, the blade of the Mycenaean swords usually contained distinctive grooves which were not present on the Texas bronze sword. Then on February 26, 1999, while researching an old Mycenaean shipwreck found in the Mediterranean and excavated by Texas A&M, I came across several photos and a description of the bronze short sword recovered from that ship that sounded and looked very familiar. I now read from that description. Archaeologist Faith Hensel lifts an 18-inch long Canaanite sword from the seabed. The sword was cast in one piece. Its handle is inlaid with African blackwood and ivory and has been preserved by a thick mantle of marine incrustation. That's the description from this picture here. And this is the sword here, and this is once it's been cleaned. This is from a different publication, but the same sword. This Canaanite sword, which had been recovered from the Mycenaean shipwreck, looked remarkably similar in attribute to the sword from Texas. After further research, it did indeed appear to me that the two swords had enough attribute similarities both in the hilt and the blade to indicate that the Texas sword, in all probability, had come from the Canaanite culture, with a date of around 13 BCE. Okay, I would just like to talk, just briefly, a few of these attributes that I find to be why I would be willing to make the claim that this is most likely a Canaanite short sword. We're going to start with the one that came off the Mycenaean shipwreck. First, as I noted, the sword is cast in one piece. This is just one solid piece here. You have the distinction between the hilt and the blade, but it is actually just one solid piece. It measures 18 inches long from end to end. Has a shallow central ridge on the blade, so you see that this blade actually on both sides would bow to make a slight little upper ridge line at the center on the blade. The handle is inlaid with African blackwood and ivory, so here it's less pronounced, those ridges I was talking about earlier with the Texas sword, because you actually still have embedded into this hilt the blackwood and the ivory. Now let's look at the Texas sword. The sword is cast in one piece. It's easier to see here because we don't have any of the inlay in the hilt, but this is just one solid piece. It measures 15 inches long, so it's a little bit shorter, but similar enough when you're talking about swords. Still enough to do damage. It has the distinctive shallow ridge again when in design within the blade itself on both sides, that forming that shallow central ridge. The handle has deep ridges and remnants of rivets. I chose this one, this side of this short sword rather than the other side because it was more. It was just directionally would fit better dramatically when I did that went from one sword to the other. But that's why I wanted to point out in that earlier slide there is evidence of the rivet still embedded in this in the hilt there. So with these ridge lines and the rivets would indicate that there was definitely something had been embedded in it, whether blackwood, ivory, or something else that had long since perished. So here's the two side by side. And initial examinations performed on the sword do seem to indicate that it is an authentic artifact, and that much I'd be willing to maybe stake my own, even though I'm new in the profession, my short career, on that I would argue that yes, we're definitely looking at an authentic artifact. All of the scientific tests that were done on it and stuff. This isn't someone that just went out back, knew a little bit about metal making and produced this based on the elements and trace elements within the sword itself. It's a very the way, the detail that was made, that it was cast in one piece rather than a lot of people, and blade and sword makers today often will cast the hilt separate from the blade. That didn't seem to be. So relative dating as well, based on attribute analysis, support this conclusion. Its origin, whether truly from Texas or not, is another matter. And my wife always tells me, and I am the eternal skeptic, so I take it takes a lot for me to be convinced that it actually came from where it came from, just like, I guess, and all the other professionals in my field. I believe that many more tests and further examination, including a possible X-ray of the sword, particularly the hilt, and that was something that Dr. Jones had wanted to do at the time, and because it was taken away from us so quickly, we were not able to manage. But we did want to get X-rays of that hilt, look more specifically if we could pick up those rivets. The side appear to have been eroded pretty flat. On the other side, it was, you could see one or two of those more distinctively. But with an X-ray, we might be able to even pick them up better. Need to be done. A closer look at the geographic location in which the sword was alleged also needs to be done. Primarily, a comparison of the sediments in Texas from the hole in which the sword was claimed to have been found and the sediments taken from the sword hilt itself. We actually have the fingerprints taken from the soil, like I said, and I feel rather confident that soil was in contact with that sword for quite some time, based on the presence of the copper in it. And I feel that if we were to go back to where the sword was claimed to have come from and get a soil sample and look at its basal elements and trace elements, we could, if they were totally opposite or didn't have the same elements, that this was a fake, that the sword didn't come from there. If they do have the same trace elements, it would be a little harder to argue, because some soils have bigger markers than others. But I think to at least give it a try, which hasn't been done. That was a suggestion I made when I presented this paper back in '99 at a BYU conference, and presented my paper to farms. And to my knowledge, and if someone's from farms, you can ask me a question or make a statement after my paper. To my knowledge, none of what my suggestions were about taking it to the next stage have been followed through. After further research, hopefully some of the answers to the questions the sword present will be found. If this is a legitimate find, then it is quite the discovery. If it isn't, then it's a good opportunity for us to use the means available to disprove and uncover the fraud which this sword may represent. Thank you. Yep. Well, like I said, we never actually talked to the arrowhead collector himself, and those of you who might be collectors yourself out there realize probably why he wouldn't have. But the claim, so this is going to be, and that's why at the beginning of my paper, as it was relayed to me, the story goes that he was digging for Clovis. Now, if you're digging for Clovis, that means you have a good reason, you have found Clovis at that point. Yeah. Yeah, and that wasn't the claim he made. He just simply was, the reason why he was digging the hole he was digging with his bulldozer was because he knew that quite likely he was going to be hitting Clovis points. So if someone from farms is out there, they can tell me, because like they don't communicate with me very much. And my recommendation was that we would actually, the first thing would be to have someone go to the site itself, collect a soil sample in which Dr. Jones could then do the same exact test to it that we did to the sediment I removed from the sword, to kind of compare those trace elements to see if, in fact, that it came from. And now in defense, as I've thought about this myself, you have to realize this guy was digging with a bulldozer for one. He claims it came at a depth of about 6 feet. It could have come in using a bulldozer. I mean, it's not like what I would do if I'm out excavating. Often I use a trowel and take it centimeter by centimeter. It's tedious work. But so it could have come at any depth between that 6 feet. He claims it. So I mean, I would find it hard for him to, if he came and said, I found it at exactly 6 feet, I'd be hard for me to see that he stopped exactly as he hit it or something. So it was somewhere between ground level and 6 feet. But his comment was it was found at about a depth of 6 feet below surface. Yes, we are. The validity to this would be, and if in fact we were able to prove the provenience of this, it is interesting that it would have come from an actual Native American site, but much older than where the bronze sword would have been. But that's neither here nor there. I've excavated sites where, I found late prehistoric stuff with much earlier stuff, just because you have superposition and through time, things get deposited on top of each other. Yes. I don't know. It went on a plane back to Texas and haven't heard or seen of it from it since. Kind of silent. Went silent. There was, like I said, we weren't given that much time. Dr. Jones, to his credit, we did as much as we could with the time we had to do whatever type of scientific analysis and testing we could do on it. I did as much documentation with photos and drawings to help me, like I said, in my paper, because my job is going to be to try and put try to put a cultural affiliation with it. I knew that I was going to use those attributes I discussed in my paper to try and tie it to something specific from a Bronze Age culture.
Could it also have, you referred to it as a sword, could it also have been a spear point?
You could, it's 15 inches long. It's not that very long. Of that picture from where Dr. Jones was holding it, kind of, I was going to point that out and didn't, but it kind of shows the scale. When I first heard about this, when Dr. Jones asked me to assist him, I was thinking sword. I'm coming from, me and my brothers, we made swords. Yeah. Well, not even Star Wars. When we're talking swords, we're talking cleavers, So when I saw it, I was actually disappointed initially. I thought, this is a sword. So, a large dagger, I guess you could call it. But that's very common as I did my research on bronze cultures, the Greek cultures, even the Celtic cultures. They all had what they called, even in the literature, short swords, which were more around that 18-inch length. And whether it could or couldn't have been, you could use probably any type of knife. I could probably take a butter knife and tie it to a stick and use it as a spear tip. So I can't argue for or against that it was being used as a spear tip or not. I would find it highly unlikely due to the fact that a sword has a hilt. That's something that if you're going to use, I would assume if they wanted to, let's say, just for the argument, someone came across this, Native American, who wanted to use this, the assumption would be is that they probably break the hilt off. It's much easier to haft a blade than a blade that's already been hafted and sent to a hilt. And there's no indications of any type of damage to the blade or the hilt. Like I said, this is cast as one single piece. There was no evidence on the hilt that it might have been, sinew or something if someone had tried to haft this at any point. Yes?
This particular kind of rock, how quickly does it deteriorate, and what are the conditions that would preserve it more substantially?
That's a good question, one that I'll defer to another specialist. I'm an archaeologist, and often when I have those questions myself, I will go to a geologist or someone else, and I don't want to mislead you. I know that at the time that was when it came out, I was actually surprised that the soil actually had the copper in it, and it had been explained to me at the time, I think by Dave Tingey, about that leaching process, that over a period of time with the breakdown, as you're talking, that the certain metals or certain items within the metals, arsenic would be one, would leach into the soil to show that there was a prolonged connection between the two. As far as metal breakdown, just from personal experience, it really depends on if it came from West Texas. Those of you who might have ever had the misfortune of going to West Texas, and I'm sorry for any Texans, it's very arid, very dry, very deserty. Any type of preservation to coming from an archaeological standpoint, it would be a little more pristine than, let's say, the swamplands of the bayou or something. So.